3 months ago, Caleb Turner had almost nothing left. No steady job, no savings worth mentioning, no fiancé, and no real plan for what came next. At 34 years old, he found himself staring at a future that looked emptier than he ever imagined. Then, during a county auction that nobody seemed to care about, he made a decision that even he thought was ridiculous. For less money than a used pickup truck, Caleb bought an abandoned fire lookout tower sitting alone on top of a mountain. The place had been empty for nearly 40 years. No electricity, no running water, no nearby neighbors. Most people thought it was worthless. Some even laughed when they heard he bought it. At first, Caleb agreed with them. His plan was simple: clean it up, repair a few things, sell it for a profit, move on. But on his third week inside the tower, while clearing out decades of dust and forgotten equipment, he discovered something nobody had mentioned during the auction. Hidden beneath a stack of rusted shelves was a steel door, locked, sealed shut. And according to the last surviving ranger who worked there, nobody had opened it since the summer of 1984, the day a fire lookout named Walter Reed vanished without a trace. Most people assumed Walter had simply left. Others believed he got lost in the wilderness. But when Caleb finally opened that storage room, he uncovered a collection of journals, maps, and documents that told a very different story. A story someone had spent 40 years trying to bury. And the deeper Caleb dug, the more dangerous the truth became. Because Walter Reed hadn't disappeared by accident, and somebody clearly didn't want his story found. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from today and what time it is where you are right now. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always amazing to see people joining these stories from all around the world. And if you enjoy stories about abandoned places, hidden mysteries, wilderness survival, forgotten secrets, and life-changing discoveries, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. It helps support the channel and ensures you never miss a new adventure. Now let's go back to the day Caleb Turner first saw the old lookout tower standing alone above the mountains, completely unaware that it was hiding a secret untouched for 40 years. The layoff happened on a Tuesday morning. Caleb Turner remembered that detail because Tuesdays had always been ordinary, the kind of day nobody expected to change their life. Yet by noon, he was carrying a cardboard box through the parking lot of the construction company where he had worked for nearly 11 years. A coffee mug, a framed photograph, a few notebooks. Everything else stayed behind. The company was downsizing. That was the explanation. The economy, rising costs, new management. Plenty of reasons. None of them paid his bills. 3 weeks later, his fiancée packed her belongings and left the apartment. The conversation lasted less than 30 minutes. There was no screaming, no dramatic argument. Somehow that made it worse. "I don't know who you are anymore," she told him quietly. Then she was gone. By the end of the month, Caleb found himself sitting alone in a nearly empty apartment, calculating how many weeks remained before his savings disappeared completely. The answer wasn't encouraging. For several days, he applied for jobs, sent resumes, made phone calls. Nothing happened. Every opportunity seemed to lead nowhere. Eventually, frustration drove him out of the apartment. One rainy afternoon, while killing time at the county courthouse, he noticed a bulletin board covered with public notices and auction announcements. Most involved old vehicles or abandoned properties. Then one listing caught his attention. Former fire lookout tower, county property auction. Structure sold as is, remote access only, no utilities. Minimum bid, $2,500. Caleb laughed out loud. Nobody in their right mind would buy a fire lookout tower. Yet the more he looked at the listing, the more curious he became. The photograph showed a tall wooden structure standing alone above a mountain ridge, weathered, forgotten, isolated. Something about it appealed to him, maybe because it looked as abandoned as he felt. The auction took place the following week. Only 6 people attended. Most came for equipment and vehicles. Nobody seemed interested in the tower. The auctioneer barely spent 2 minutes discussing it. Former state fire lookout, decommissioned in the late 80s. Access road requires maintenance. Structure sold as is. Silence followed. No bids. The auctioneer looked around the room. $2,500. Nothing. Caleb surprised himself by raising a hand. Several people turned to stare. The auctioneer blinked. $2,500. Caleb nodded. No one countered. The gavel struck seconds later. Just like that. He owned a mountain, or at least a tower sitting on one. Even he wasn't sure why he bought it. The decision felt irrational, yet for the first time in weeks, he felt something besides frustration. Curiosity. 3 days later, he loaded camping supplies into his pickup truck and began the drive. The journey took most of the day. Highways became narrow roads became gravel tracks. Eventually, even the gravel disappeared. According to county records, the final section required driving along an old forestry route no longer maintained regularly. The truck bounced violently over potholes and exposed roots. Twice he considered turning around. Then the trees opened. Caleb immediately hit the brakes. The tower stood on the highest ridge for miles. Tall, solitary, watching over endless forests stretching toward distant mountains. For several seconds, he simply sat there staring through the windshield. The structure looked larger than expected, roughly 5 stories tall. Wooden supports anchored into stone. A glass observation room occupied the top level. Time had weathered the exterior, but the tower remained standing proudly against the sky. The sight took his breath away, not because it was beautiful, because it felt alive somehow, like a forgotten piece of history refusing to disappear. Climbing the stairs proved more difficult than anticipated. Wind swept across the ridge constantly. Each step creaked beneath his boots. By the time he reached the observation room, he was breathing heavily. Then he looked outside. The entire valley spread beneath him. Forests, rivers, mountains, endless wilderness in every direction. Caleb slowly turned in a circle. He had never seen anything like it. Suddenly, the apartment, the city, the traffic, the layoffs, all of it felt very far away. The observation room contained decades of dust and neglect. Old equipment sat abandoned in corners. Maps remained pinned to walls. Rusted radios occupied shelves. Yet despite everything, the room felt strangely intact, as though the last ranger had stepped out for lunch and never returned. The thought stayed with him longer than expected. Several hours later, while exploring the lower levels, Caleb discovered old maintenance logs stored inside a filing cabinet. Most entries involved weather conditions, wildfire reports, and equipment repairs. Nothing unusual. Then one name began appearing repeatedly: Walter Reed. Nearly every document mentioned him: inspection reports, duty schedules, supply requests. Walter Reed apparently worked at the tower for years. Curious. Caleb continued reading. Then he found the final log entry, dated August 14, 1984. No explanation followed, no additional reports, no farewell note. Nothing. The records simply stopped. Strange. As evening approached, Caleb carried supplies upstairs and prepared to spend the night. The tower lacked electricity, so lanterns provided light. Wind rattled windows occasionally. The entire structure creaked softly after sunset, yet none of it felt unsettling. It felt old, like the tower was settling into sleep. Shortly before dark, another vehicle appeared below. Headlights climbed the access road slowly before stopping near the base of the ridge. A man emerged, elderly, broad-shouldered despite his age. He looked up toward the tower and waved casually. Curious. Caleb climbed down to meet him. "You the fool who bought this place?" the old man asked with a grin. Caleb laughed. "Depends who's asking." The stranger extended a hand. "Frank Dawson." The name sounded familiar. Then Caleb remembered seeing it inside the maintenance logs. Frank noticed immediately. "Found some old records, huh?" Caleb nodded. "You worked here? Long time ago." The old man glanced toward the tower. His expression shifted slightly. Nostalgic. Maybe even sad. For nearly an hour, they talked beside the truck. Frank shared stories about wildfire seasons, mountain storms, and life inside the tower. The more he spoke, the more Caleb realized how important the structure once was. Hundreds of square miles depended on the people stationed there. Then Caleb mentioned Walter Reed. The reaction was immediate. Frank's smile disappeared, not dramatically, just enough. "You found his name?" Caleb nodded. "Who was he?" The old man looked toward the darkening forest below. For several moments, he didn't answer. Finally, he sighed. "Best lookout we ever had." Silence followed. Then Frank added something unexpected. "Some folks still think he's up there." Caleb laughed softly. "In the tower." Frank shook his head. "Looking for answers." The statement sounded strange enough to hold his attention. "What answers?" The old man smiled faintly. "That's a long story." Before leaving, Frank glanced toward the lower levels of the tower. His expression became thoughtful again. "There's a room down there nobody's opened in 40 years. Caleb frowned. "What room?" Frank opened his truck door. "Storage room beneath the supply level." Silence. "Why hasn't anyone opened it?" The old man looked back at the tower one final time. Then he said 5 words that stayed with Caleb all night. "Because Walter locked it himself." Minutes later, the truck disappeared down the mountain road. Darkness settled over the ridge. Wind moved through the tower supports. Caleb stood alone, staring at the structure towering above him. Because suddenly, owning an abandoned fire lookout didn't feel quite as simple as he originally thought. Caleb woke before sunrise because of the wind. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming, but strong enough to make the old tower groan softly in the darkness. For a few confused seconds, he forgot where he was. Then he opened his eyes and saw the lantern hanging beside the observation room window, beyond the glass. Dawn was beginning to paint the mountains in shades of blue and gold. He climbed from his sleeping bag and immediately crossed to the windows. The view stopped him cold. Low clouds filled the valleys below like a white ocean. Mountain peaks emerged from the mist like islands. Sunlight slowly spilled across the landscape. For the first time in months, Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time. Peace. The feeling lasted until he remembered his bank account. Then reality returned. After a quick breakfast, he began exploring the tower more thoroughly. If he intended to sell the place eventually, he needed to understand exactly what he owned. The structure consisted of several levels connected by narrow staircases. The observation room occupied the top. Below that sat living quarters, a communications floor, equipment storage, and a lower supply area. Most rooms contained decades of dust and forgotten gear, old weather instruments, radios, maps, filing cabinets. The deeper he explored, the more the tower felt like a time capsule. Around mid-morning, Caleb found himself standing outside on the observation deck with a notebook in hand. He started listing repairs, broken windows, loose railings, water damage, rotting floorboards. The list grew alarmingly fast. Yet strangely, he didn't mind. The work gave him something concrete to focus on, something simpler than job applications and rejection emails. By noon, he had filled an entire page. Then he discovered the old generator shed behind the tower. The structure looked nearly as abandoned as everything else. Inside sat a massive, rusted generator that probably hadn't run in decades. While examining it, he found faded maintenance records pinned to a wall. Most signatures belonged to people he didn't recognize. Then one familiar name appeared again. Walter Reed. Caleb frowned. The man seemed to be everywhere. Every logbook, every report, every maintenance record. Walter wasn't simply an employee. He had practically lived here. The realization only deepened his curiosity. Later that afternoon, another vehicle climbed the mountain road. This time, it wasn't Frank. A small SUV emerged from the trees and parked near the tower. A woman stepped out carrying a camera bag and notepad. She appeared to be around Caleb's age. Dark hair, confident posture, curious eyes. "You must be the new owner," she called out while approaching. Caleb nodded cautiously. "Depends who's asking." The woman laughed. "Fair answer." She extended a hand. "Emily Brooks, local newspaper." Caleb shook it. "There's a newspaper interested in abandoned fire towers?" Emily smiled. "Not usually, but people around here have been talking." Of course they had. Small towns always talked. Within minutes, she was interviewing him beside the tower. Most questions focused on restoration plans, why he bought the property, what he intended to do with it. The conversation remained casual until she asked a seemingly random question. "Have you found anything connected to Walter Reed?" Caleb immediately looked up. "You know about him?" Emily's expression changed slightly. Interested. "Everybody around here knows about Walter." That answer caught his attention. Frank had reacted similarly. So had the old records. Walter clearly mattered. "What happened to him?" Emily adjusted her camera strap. "Depends who you ask." Not exactly reassuring. According to local legends, Walter disappeared during the summer of 1984. Some people believed he quit and left town. Others believed he got lost while hiking. A few claimed stranger explanations. None came with evidence. The mystery had simply lingered for decades. Before leaving, Emily glanced toward the tower's lower levels. "Did Frank tell you about the locked room?" Caleb nearly laughed. Apparently everyone knew about it. "He mentioned it." Emily nodded slowly. "Nobody ever opened it." "Why?" The reporter shrugged. "Nobody found the key." The simple answer somehow made the mystery more intriguing. After she left, Caleb spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning one of the storage floors. Dust coated every surface. Boxes filled with outdated supplies occupied entire corners. Most contents were worthless, yet occasionally he discovered small reminders of the tower's history. Old photographs, ranger badges, handwritten notes. The people who worked there seemed remarkably human. One photo showed several rangers posing beside a pickup truck. Another captured a group celebrating someone's birthday. For a place so isolated, the tower once felt surprisingly alive. Then he found something unusual. Hidden inside a drawer sat an employee directory from 1984. Walter Reed's name appeared near the top. So did Frank Dawson's. Caleb smiled. Finally, a direct connection. Then he noticed a handwritten note scribbled beside Walter's entry. Check lower storage inventory before August inspection. His pulse quickened slightly. Lower storage, the same level containing the locked room. Coincidence? Maybe. Yet the timing felt interesting. He spent the next hour searching that floor more carefully. Eventually, he located the door Frank mentioned. Hidden behind stacks of old shelving units sat a heavy steel door painted gray. Unlike everything else in the tower, it appeared surprisingly solid. A large padlock secured the handle. Dust covered the surface. No signs suggested anyone had touched it in years. Caleb stood there longer than necessary. The door felt different, not because it was locked, because somebody clearly wanted it locked. The distinction mattered. Most storage rooms became inaccessible through neglect. This one had been deliberately secured. As evening approached, he carried supplies upstairs and prepared dinner. Yet his thoughts kept returning to the steel door. After sunset, he sat beside a lantern reading through another box of old records. Most contained routine reports. Then he found a newspaper clipping dated September 1984. The headline immediately caught his attention. Local fire lookout still missing after 6 weeks. Caleb sat upright. The article described extensive search efforts. Rangers, volunteers, helicopters, hundreds of acres searched. No trace of Walter Reed. Then one paragraph made him pause. Authorities declined to comment on reports that Reed had been conducting independent surveys shortly before his disappearance. Independent surveys. The phrase seemed oddly specific. Caleb reread it twice, then 3 times. Surveys of what? The article never explained. The clipping ended abruptly with no resolution, no follow-up. No answers, only questions. Outside, darkness settled completely across the mountain. Wind rattled the observation room windows again. Caleb folded the article and stared toward the lower levels of the tower. Somewhere beneath him sat a locked room nobody had entered in 40 years. A room connected to a missing ranger whose story still lingered across the entire region. For the first time since buying the tower, he realized something important. He wasn't restoring an abandoned building. He had inherited a mystery. And judging by the way people reacted whenever Walter Reed's name appeared, the answers hidden behind that steel door might be far more important than anyone wanted to admit. By the 4th day, Caleb had developed the routine. Wake before sunrise, brew coffee on the small camping stove, watch the morning fog drift through the valleys below, then spend the rest of the day cleaning, repairing, and exploring the old lookout tower. The structure was beginning to feel less like an abandoned property and more like a home. A strange home, perhaps, but a home nonetheless. The work helped keep his mind occupied. Every loose board replaced and every window cleaned felt like progress. More importantly, it kept him from worrying about everything waiting for him back in town. Yet no matter how busy he stayed, his thoughts always returned to the same thing: the locked storage room. The steel door seemed to pull at his curiosity. Every trip through the lower levels reminded him it was there, silent, unopened, waiting. That morning, while cleaning an old communications room, he discovered another piece of the tower's history. Hidden beneath decades of dust sat a cardboard box filled with photographs. Most showed wildfires, ranger crews, and maintenance projects. Nothing unusual. Then he found a picture of Walter Reed. For the first time, the missing ranger became more than a name on old reports. Walter appeared to be in his early 30s, tall, lean, smiling beside the tower railing with mountains stretching behind him. The photograph had been taken only weeks before his disappearance. Caleb studied it carefully. There was nothing mysterious about the man. He looked ordinary, friendly even. Yet an entire region still remembered him 40 years later. That fact alone made the photograph significant. Turning it over, he found handwriting on the back. Summer 1984. Best view in the state. Walter. Caleb smiled slightly. The comment sounded exactly like something someone would write while working in a place like this. Then he noticed another figure standing near the edge of the frame, a second ranger partially cropped out of the image. Curious. He searched through the remaining photographs. Several more included the same person. Older, broad-shouldered, familiar somehow. Then he realized why. Frank Dawson, the old ranger who visited him. Frank and Walter had worked together. The discovery felt obvious in hindsight, yet seeing them side by side somehow made the story more real. Around noon, Emily Brooks returned to the tower. This time she brought lunch and a camera. Figured you'd either appreciate company or die of boredom up here. Caleb laughed and invited her inside. The afternoon passed surprisingly quickly. Emily wandered through the tower taking photographs while Caleb continuing cleaning. Unlike most reporters, she seemed genuinely interested in the history rather than simply searching for a headline. Eventually, their conversation returned to Walter Reed. You know what's strange? Emily said while examining an old wall map. The official records about his disappearance are incredibly thin. Caleb looked up. Meaning someone stopped asking questions unusually fast. That caught his attention. Emily explained that most missing person cases generated years of paperwork, follow-up reports, interviews, search summaries. Walter's file seemed different. The investigation simply ended. No conclusion, no explanation. Almost as though everyone collectively decided to move on. The more she talked, the stranger the situation sounded. Then Caleb showed her the newspaper clipping he had found. Emily read it carefully. Her expression sharpened immediately when she reached the phrase, independent surveys. There it is again. Caleb frowned. Again? Emily nodded. I've seen references to surveys in a few old articles. She looked thoughtful now. Nobody ever explains what Walter was surveying. Another question added itself to the growing pile. Before leaving, Emily promised to search newspaper archives in town. If anything existed beyond the public records, she'd find it. Caleb appreciated the help more than he expected. The mystery had become easier to investigate, with someone else asking questions too. After she left, he returned to the lower levels. The steel door waited exactly where he left it. Dust covered the padlock. Shadows filled the narrow hallway around it. For several minutes, Caleb simply examined the area. Then something caught his eye. Scratches. Tiny scratches around the doorframe. He crouched closer. They weren't recent, but they were definitely there. The marks looked like someone had attempted to pry the door open years ago. The realization surprised him. Apparently, he wasn't the first person curious about what lay inside. He followed the scratches along the wall and discovered something even stranger. Hidden behind a nearby shelf sat an old wooden cabinet, Most drawers were empty. One remained locked. Caleb smiled despite himself. The tower seemed obsessed with secrets. After several minutes of searching, he found the drawer key taped beneath the cabinet. Inside lay a collection of maintenance records. Most were routine. Then one document immediately caught his attention. Inventory Transfer Report, August 10th, 1984. Only 4 days before Walter disappeared. According to the report, multiple boxes had been moved into lower storage, the same lower storage protected by the steel door. Caleb's pulse quickened. The document listed no contents, just quantities. 6 boxes transferred, signed by Walter Reed. He reread the report several times. Whatever entered that room shortly before Walter vanished remained there, assuming nobody opened it afterward. Suddenly, the locked door felt even more important. As evening approached, clouds gathered over the mountains. Rain began shortly before sunset. Wind rattled the tower windows while Caleb cooked dinner in the observation room. The weather created a strangely cozy atmosphere. Lantern light reflected across the glass. Rain tapped steadily against the roof. Yet even as he ate, his attention kept drifting toward Walter's photograph sitting on the table. The missing ranger seemed to be leaving clues everywhere. Logs, reports, photos, inventory records, almost as though he wanted someone to keep looking. Later that night, unable to sleep, Caleb decided to explore one final section of the tower. The lowest level beneath the supply floor contained little more than storage space and support beams. Most of it appeared untouched for decades. While examining one corner with a flashlight, he noticed a loose wooden panel hidden behind stacked crates. Curious. He pulled it aside. A narrow cavity appeared behind the wall. Inside rested a small metal box covered in dust. His pulse immediately quickened. Carefully, he lifted it out. The box wasn't locked. Inside sat only 3 items: an old photograph, a folded map, and a brass key. Caleb stared at them for several seconds. The photograph showed Walter Reed standing beside the steel door. The map depicted the lower levels of the tower, and next to the drawing of the storage room, someone had written 2 words in red ink: "Not empty." Silence filled the room. Slowly, Caleb picked up the brass key. It felt heavy in his hand, old, worn, important. Then he turned the photograph over. A message had been written across the back. The handwriting matched Walter's. "If you're seeing this, I never came back for it." Caleb sat perfectly still. Rain continued falling outside. Wind moved through the tower supports. Somewhere above him stood a locked storage room untouched for 40 years. And for the first time since buying the lookout tower, he had reason to believe the key might finally be within reach. The only question now was whether he was ready to discover why Walter Reed wanted that room sealed in the first place. Caleb barely slept after finding the brass key. The photograph, map, and handwritten message remained spread across the table in the observation room long after midnight. Rain continued drumming against the windows while the old tower creaked softly around him. Every few minutes, he picked up the key again, turning it over in his hands. It wasn't a modern key. The brass had darkened with age. Tiny scratches covered the surface. Someone had used it regularly once. The question was simple. Did it open the storage room? The answer felt close enough to touch. Yet morning couldn't arrive fast enough. At sunrise, the storm finally moved east. Low clouds drifted through the valleys below the mountain. The forest looked freshly washed. Caleb drank coffee while staring at the steel door several floors beneath him. He told himself he should wait. Maybe call Frank first. Maybe bring Emily. Maybe think it through. Instead, 20 minutes later, he was standing in front of the lock with the brass key in hand. His pulse hammered against his ribs. 40 years. Nobody had opened this room in 40 years. The realization alone made the moment feel important. Slowly, he inserted the key into the padlock. It fit perfectly. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then he turned it. A sharp metallic click echoed through the hallway. Silence followed. Caleb exhaled slowly. The lock opened. The first mystery was solved. Now came the harder part. He removed the padlock and gripped the handle. The steel door resisted initially. Dust and age had fused portions of the frame together. He pulled harder. The hinges groaned loudly. Then the door swung inward. Stale air drifted from the darkness beyond. The room appeared surprisingly large, roughly the size of a small apartment. Flashlight in hand, Caleb stepped inside cautiously. Dust covered nearly everything. Shelves lined the walls. Filing cabinets stood in neat rows. Wooden crates occupied entire sections of the room. Yet despite decades of neglect, the space felt organized, deliberate. Walter hadn't used the room for storage. He had used it for something else. Caleb moved deeper into the room. His flashlight beam swept across labels attached to boxes. Weather records, survey notes, fire reports, maintenance logs, thousands of documents. The sheer volume stunned him. Then he noticed something strange. Most boxes appeared untouched. One table near the center of the room looked different, cleaner, more organized, almost like a workspace. Several notebooks sat neatly stacked beside an old lantern. Maps covered portions of the tabletop. A chair remained positioned exactly where someone last used it. His pulse quickened immediately. Walter's workspace. The realization felt obvious. Carefully, Caleb opened the top notebook. The handwriting matched the message on the photograph. Walter Reed. Finally, the first real clue. The journal began with ordinary observations, weather patterns, wildlife sightings, forest conditions. Yet after several pages, the tone changed. Walter started documenting something unusual, repeatedly. Unknown vehicle spotted near Eastern Ridge. Unmarked survey markers discovered beyond Fire Road. Activity after dark. Caleb frowned. None of those entries sounded related to firefighting. Curious. He continued reading. The entries grew increasingly detailed. Walter described finding trails that didn't appear on official maps, temporary campsites hidden deep within protected forest land, evidence of people operating in remote areas without permits. At first, he assumed poachers. Then he discovered something else. Survey stakes, property markers, construction equipment. None of it made sense. Why would someone secretly survey wilderness land? Caleb sat down heavily. The mystery had just become much larger than a missing ranger. Then he noticed a folded map tucked between journal pages. Carefully opening it, he revealed a detailed drawing of the surrounding mountains. Several locations had been circled in red ink. One area appeared repeatedly throughout Walter's notes. East Ridge. The name surfaced again and again. His pulse quickened. East Ridge clearly mattered. The question was, why? Several hours passed while Caleb explored the room. Every discovery created new questions. Old photographs showed unfamiliar men working deep in the forest. Survey documents contained handwritten notes questioning official boundaries. One file included copies of land ownership records. Another contained newspaper clippings. Walter had been investigating something. Not casually, obsessively. Then Caleb found the final journal. Unlike the others, this one sat alone inside a locked desk drawer. The key was still hanging nearby, almost as though Walter expected someone to find it eventually. The last entries immediately felt different. The handwriting appeared hurried, uneven, concerned. Someone entered the tower while I was away. Caleb sat upright. He read faster. Walter described noticing missing papers, moved equipment, signs that somebody had searched the storage room. The ranger became convinced he was being watched. Then came another entry. Frank says I'm imagining things. I hope he's right. Caleb froze. Frank knew, or at least knew something. The realization settled heavily in his mind. The final pages were even more alarming. Walter wrote about a meeting planned near East Ridge. According to the journal, someone had agreed to share information, evidence, proof. Whatever Walter was investigating had finally reached a turning point. Then the last entry appeared. August 13th, 1984. One day before he disappeared, Caleb's pulse hammered as he read. If these notes are found, it means I was right. The surveys weren't mistakes. Someone is hiding something out there. Tomorrow I meet the man who promised answers. The entry ended there. No follow-up, no explanation, no conclusion. Walter vanished the next day. Silence filled the storage room. Caleb stared at the page for a long time. Then his attention shifted toward a metal cabinet positioned against the far wall. Unlike everything else, it remained locked. Another lock. Another secret. Yet this one looked different. A small label had been attached near the handle. Handwritten. Simple. 4 words. Open only if necessary. Walter's handwriting again. Caleb slowly stood. The storage room had already revealed more than he expected. Missing surveys, hidden investigations, a mysterious meeting. Evidence someone searched the room decades ago. Yet somehow the locked cabinet felt even more important. His instincts told him the biggest secret wasn't inside the journals. It was waiting behind that door. And for the first time since buying the abandoned lookout tower, Caleb realized Walter Reed hadn't locked this room to hide from people. He locked it to protect something. The only question now was whether whatever he protected was still inside. Caleb stood in front of the locked cabinet for nearly a full minute before touching it. The storage room had already revealed enough secrets for one day. Walter's journals, the hidden surveys, the mysterious East Ridge references, the warnings about being watched. Every discovery seemed to pull him deeper into a story that should have ended 40 years ago. Yet the cabinet remained unopened, waiting. The label attached to it felt almost personal now. Open only if necessary. Caleb couldn't help smiling. If Walter had truly wanted nobody to open it, he wouldn't have left the key hanging nearby. Slowly, he unlocked the cabinet. The door opened with a soft metallic groan. Inside sat 3 shelves. Unlike the rest of the room, everything here appeared meticulously organized. Labeled folders, sealed envelopes, small boxes. Walter clearly considered these items important, very important. Caleb removed the first folder and opened it carefully. Photographs spilled onto the desk. Most showed sections of forest, trails, creeks, mountain ridges. At first, they looked ordinary. Then he noticed details highlighted with red circles, survey stakes, painted boundary markers, temporary camps. Walter had been documenting something systematically. The second folder contained maps, lots of maps, some official, others hand-drawn. Several showed different versions of the same area. Caleb immediately noticed inconsistencies. Roads appeared on one map but vanished on another. Property lines shifted. Entire sections of wilderness changed designation over time. He wasn't an expert, but even he could tell something wasn't right. Then he found a document labeled East Ridge Development Survey. His pulse quickened instantly. East Ridge again. Walter's journals mentioned the location repeatedly. According to the paperwork, a large land acquisition project had been proposed in the region during the early 1980s. Yet several pages appeared missing. Entire sections had been removed. The pattern felt familiar now. Missing information seemed to follow everything Walter investigated. Around noon, Caleb heard a truck approaching the tower. Moments later, Frank Dawson appeared carrying a toolbox and a thermos of coffee. "Thought you might need this." Caleb accepted the thermos gratefully. The old ranger immediately noticed the open cabinet and the documents spread across the table. His expression darkened slightly. Not surprise, recognition. "You opened it." Caleb nodded. "You knew about these?" Frank stared at one of the photographs for several seconds. "Some of them." The answer wasn't enough. Caleb pushed one of Walter's journals across the table. "Frank, what was he investigating?" Silence settled between them. Wind rattled the tower windows. Finally, the old ranger sat down heavily. Walter asked too many questions. Not exactly an explanation, yet it was more than Frank had shared before. Over the next hour, bits of the story emerged. During the early 1980s, Walter became interested in irregular survey activity throughout the national forest. Official maps didn't match what he observed in the field. Temporary crews appeared without permits. Boundaries shifted. Records changed. Most people ignored it. Walter didn't. He thought somebody was stealing land, Frank admitted quietly. Caleb frowned. "Stealing an entire forest?" The old ranger shrugged. "Not the forest, pieces of it." The answer sounded absurd, yet after reviewing the maps, Caleb couldn't dismiss it. Then he showed Frank the final journal entry, the one mentioning a meeting. The old ranger read it silently. When he finished, he looked older somehow, tired. "I remember that day." Caleb immediately sat forward. "What happened?" Frank stared through the observation room windows toward the mountains. "Walter left before sunrise." Silence followed. And he never came back. The simple statement carried enormous weight. According to Frank, search teams spent weeks combing the wilderness. Helicopters flew overhead. Rangers searched trails. Volunteers checked remote campsites. Nothing. No body, no equipment, no sign of Walter. Eventually, people assumed he got lost or left voluntarily. Yet Frank never believed either explanation. "Why?" Caleb asked. The old ranger pointed toward the documents covering the table. "Because he left all this behind." Caleb understood immediately. Walter had spent years collecting evidence. No one walks away from that without taking it, not intentionally. The realization lingered after Frank departed later that afternoon. The mystery no longer felt historical. It felt unfinished. Someone had interrupted Walter's investigation before he could complete it. The question was, who? As evening approached, Caleb returned to the cabinet. One shelf remained unexplored. Hidden behind several folders sat a small metal lockbox. Unlike the cabinet, this one lacked a key. Curious, he examined it more closely. The latch wasn't particularly secure. After several minutes of careful effort, it popped open. Inside rested a single notebook. Nothing else. The cover immediately caught his attention. Field Journal number 7. Walter Reed. 7, meaning at least 6 others existed. Caleb opened the notebook carefully. The entries differed from everything he'd read so far. More personal, more urgent. Walter described specific encounters. Strange vehicles deep in the forest, unknown men conducting surveys, equipment hidden in remote camps. Then one entry made Caleb freeze. Someone followed me back to the tower tonight. His pulse accelerated. The next pages grew increasingly tense. Walter documented footsteps outside after dark, missing equipment, signs that somebody entered areas they shouldn't have accessed. The ranger became convinced he was being monitored. Then came a name, the first actual name connected to the mystery. Richard Hale. Walter underlined it repeatedly. According to the journal, Hale managed portions of the East Ridge project. More importantly, Walter believed Hale knew exactly what was happening. Caleb had never heard the name before, yet clearly Walter considered him important. Then he reached the final pages. The handwriting became rushed, uneven, almost frantic. The meeting is confirmed. He says he has proof. Caleb's heart pounded. He already knew what happened next. Walter disappeared the following morning. Yet beneath that entry sat another sentence, one Walter apparently added later, written darker than the rest. If I don't return, the coordinates are hidden where only a lookout would think to search. Caleb stared at the words. Coordinates. Walter had hidden something. Proof. Evidence. Maybe answers. The question was where? He reread the sentence 3 times. Then a realization struck him. A lookout would think to search. Not a ranger, not a hiker. A lookout. Someone working inside a fire tower. Caleb slowly looked around the observation room. Maps covered the walls. Old equipment filled shelves. Windows overlooked hundreds of miles of wilderness. Somewhere inside this structure, Walter left another clue, the biggest one yet. And for the first time since opening the storage room, Caleb felt certain of one thing. Walter Reed never intended his investigation to die with him. He expected someone to continue it, somehow, 40 years later. That someone had become Caleb Turner. The sentence haunted Caleb for 2 straight days. The coordinates are hidden where only a lookout would think to search. He repeated it while repairing railings, while cleaning windows, while cooking dinner over a camping stove. Walter Reed had left a clue. Not a vague clue, a deliberate one. The problem was that Caleb wasn't a lookout. He was a laid-off construction worker trying to restore a forgotten tower. Whatever seemed obvious to Walter remained completely invisible to him. On the 3rd morning, Emily arrived carrying a box of photocopied records from the town archives. The moment she stepped into the observation room, she noticed maps covering nearly every surface. Looks like you've officially become obsessed, Caleb laughed. Probably. He handed her Walter's journal. Emily read the final passage carefully. Then she frowned. A lookout would think to search. Silence followed. Both stared around the room. The observation deck, the maps, the weather equipment, the radio station. Everything seemed equally possible. For nearly an hour they searched. Nothing. Then Emily stopped beside an old fire detection map hanging on the wall. The map covered hundreds of square miles of forest. Small pins marked observation points and historical wildfire locations. "How often do you look at this?" she asked. Caleb shrugged. "Every day." "Exactly." She pointed toward a corner of the map. One pin appeared different from the others. Older. Brass instead of red. His pulse quickened. Together they removed the map from the wall. Behind it, hidden inside a narrow compartment built into the wooden paneling, rested a folded piece of paper. Caleb stared in disbelief. Emily smiled. Only a lookout would think to hide something behind the map they stare at all day. Carefully, he unfolded the paper. Coordinates, a set of precise coordinates written in Walter's handwriting. Nothing else. No explanation, no directions. Just numbers. Yet it was enough. The next step in the trail. Excitement quickly replaced frustration. Emily immediately began comparing the coordinates to county maps. 20 minutes later, she looked up. "You're not going to believe this." Caleb leaned closer. The location sat deep within the national forest, miles from roads, miles from marked trails. More importantly, it aligned almost perfectly with the East Ridge area appearing throughout Walter's journals. The same location, again and again. The mystery was finally narrowing. Later that afternoon, Frank Dawson arrived unexpectedly. When Caleb showed him the coordinates, the old ranger became unusually quiet. "You recognize them?" Caleb asked. Frank nodded slowly. "I've been there." Silence filled the room. Emily immediately sat forward. "What is it?" The old ranger hesitated. Then he pointed toward the map. "There used to be an old ranger station out there." Caleb frowned. "Used to be?" Frank nodded. "Closed long before Walter disappeared." Another abandoned structure. Another forgotten location. The pattern was becoming familiar. Frank explained that the station had served as a temporary outpost decades earlier. Eventually, roads changed, budgets tightened, and the site was abandoned. Nature reclaimed it. Most people forgot it existed. Walter clearly had not. "Why would he leave coordinates to an abandoned station?" Emily asked. Frank's expression suggested he already knew the answer, or suspected it. Because that's where he was headed. The realization landed heavily. Walter's final meeting. The evidence. The hidden investigations. Everything seemed connected to East Ridge. By sunset, Caleb had already begun preparing for the trip. Food, water, camping gear, maps, flashlights, batteries. The station sat too far away for a simple day hike. Reaching it would require crossing difficult terrain and spending at least one night in the wilderness. Yet none of that bothered him. The mystery had reached a point where turning back no longer felt possible. That evening, while organizing supplies, Caleb discovered something else inside Walter's final journal, a folded note tucked between pages. He almost missed it. The paper contained only a short message. "Trust Frank, not everyone else." Caleb stared at the sentence. The wording felt deliberate, specific. Walter trusted Frank, enough to leave instructions, yet the second half bothered him. Not everyone else. The implication suggested Walter suspected someone, maybe several people. The thought lingered as darkness settled across the mountains. The deeper he dug, the less random Walter's disappearance seemed. Around midnight, unable to sleep, Caleb stepped onto the observation deck. Stars filled the sky above the wilderness. Wind moved gently through the tower supports. The view stretched endlessly across forests and ridges. Somewhere out there sat the abandoned ranger station. Somewhere out there, Walter Reed spent his final day searching for answers. Then Caleb noticed something unusual. A light, tiny, distant, flashing briefly along the ridge far below the tower. He frowned. The light vanished, then reappeared once, twice, 3 times. Not lightning, not a vehicle. Too deliberate, too controlled. Caleb watched carefully. After several seconds, the light disappeared completely. Silence returned. The mountains looked empty again, yet a strange feeling settled into his stomach. The same feeling Walter described in his journals. The feeling of being watched. The next morning, Caleb and Emily would begin the journey toward East Ridge, toward the abandoned ranger station, toward whatever answers Walter Reed died trying to uncover. But standing alone on the observation deck beneath a sky full of stars, Caleb couldn't shake one unsettling thought. If someone else knew about Walter's hidden coordinates, then he might not be the only person heading into those mountains. Caleb and Emily left before sunrise. The lookout tower disappeared behind them as they followed an overgrown forestry road winding into the mountains. The truck could only take them so far. According to Walter's coordinates, the abandoned ranger station sat deep inside a section of wilderness that modern maps barely acknowledged. By mid-morning, they parked near a washed-out bridge and continued on foot. The forest changed almost immediately. Near the tower, trails remained visible and maintained. Out here, nature ruled everything. Fallen trees blocked old paths. Thick undergrowth swallowed forgotten roads. Moss covered nearly every sign of human activity. Yet Walter's coordinates kept them moving in the right direction. Emily walked beside Caleb, carrying a backpack stuffed with maps and camera equipment. You realize this is exactly how people end up in missing person documentaries. Caleb laughed. That's encouraging. I'm just saying. She smiled. If we find a creepy cabin, we're turning around. The conversation helped break the tension, yet both understood the importance of the journey. Walter had hidden those coordinates deliberately. Whatever waited at the ranger station mattered. Around noon, they reached the first surprising discovery. Hidden beneath vines and brush sat a weathered trail marker. The sign had fallen decades earlier. Most of the lettering had faded away. Caleb brushed dirt from the surface. East Ridge Ranger Route. His pulse quickened immediately. Walter wasn't the only person who knew about this place. The route had once been official, recognized, used regularly. Somehow, it had vanished from maps and memory. They stopped for lunch beside a stream. While eating, Emily compared modern records against copies of older maps she brought from town. The differences were impossible to ignore. Entire roads disappeared. Trails vanished. Ranger stations ceased to exist on paper. It felt less like updates and more like erasure. Somebody really wanted people to forget this area, she said quietly. Caleb nodded. The evidence increasingly supported that conclusion. A few hours later, the terrain became steeper. The trail climbed through rocky slopes and dense pine forest. Progress slowed considerably. Then they found something neither expected. A rusted metal post protruding from the ground beside the trail. Caleb immediately recognized it from Walter's photographs. A survey marker. One of the very objects appearing throughout the journals. The marker remained firmly embedded in stone despite decades of weather. More importantly, it didn't appear on any official map Emily carried. Another inconsistency. Another clue. As afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, they discovered additional markers. Some hidden, some partially removed, Yet enough remained to suggest an organized network once existed throughout the mountains. Walter wasn't imagining things. He had found real evidence. The realization strengthened their determination. By late afternoon, clouds gathered above the ridges. Wind swept through the forest. Emily glanced toward the sky. "We're probably getting rain," Caleb agreed. They pushed harder, hoping to reach the coordinates before dark. Then the forest suddenly opened. Both stopped walking. The ranger station stood across a small clearing. For several moments, neither spoke. The building looked exactly like something abandoned for 40 years should look. Weathered wood, broken windows, sagging roof. Nature had begun reclaiming the structure. Yet enough remained intact to recognize its purpose. A faded government emblem still clung to one wall. The station was real. Walter's destination was real. Everything was real. Excitement quickly replaced exhaustion. Caleb crossed the clearing first. The front door hung partially open. Inside, dust coated every surface. Sunlight streamed through broken windows. Filing cabinets sat overturned. Furniture remained scattered throughout several rooms. The place looked less abandoned and more searched. Thoroughly searched. Emily noticed it too. This wasn't caused by time. Caleb nodded. Someone had gone through the station. Drawers emptied. Shelves cleared. Papers missing. The pattern felt familiar. Very familiar. Room by room, they explored the structure. Most areas revealed nothing useful. Then Caleb found an office at the rear of the building. Unlike the rest of the station, this room contained a few surviving records, weather reports, maintenance logs, equipment inventories, ordinary paperwork. Yet one name appeared repeatedly: Walter Reed. His pulse quickened. Walter had definitely visited the station, more than once. Then Emily called from another room. "Caleb!" Her tone immediately caught his attention. He hurried toward her voice. She stood beside a wall covered with old maps. One map had been marked heavily in red pencil. Circles, notes, arrows. The handwriting matched Walter's journals exactly. "This was his workspace," Emily whispered. Caleb studied the markings. East Ridge appeared again and again. So did several unexplored valleys farther north. Then he noticed something pinned beneath the map. A photograph. His heart nearly stopped. Walter stood outside the ranger station. Beside him was another man. Not Frank, not anyone Caleb recognized. The photograph had been taken only days before Walter disappeared. On the back, a handwritten note remained visible. Meeting confirmed, August 14th. Finally, proof that Walter wasn't alone. Someone had information. Someone had met him shortly before everything ended. Then Caleb spotted something even more important. A loose floorboard beneath the desk. His pulse accelerated instantly. Carefully kneeling, he pried it upward. A narrow compartment appeared underneath. Inside rested a waterproof metal container. Emily stared. No way. Caleb opened it slowly. The contents exceeded every expectation. Maps, survey records, photographs, personal notes. Everything preserved perfectly. Walter had hidden material here. Material someone else never found. Yet among all the documents, one item stood out immediately. A folded letter. Walter's handwriting covered the envelope. To whoever finds this first. Silence filled the room. Outside, thunder rumbled across the mountains. Rain began tapping softly against the roof. Caleb opened the letter carefully. The first sentence made his stomach tighten instantly. If you're reading this, then they found the station before I could come back. He looked up at Emily. Neither spoke, because suddenly the abandoned ranger station no longer felt like the end of the trail. It felt like the beginning of something much larger. And judging by Walter's final message, he knew exactly how dangerous the truth had become. Thunder rolled across the mountains as Caleb unfolded Walter Reed's letter. Rain drummed steadily against the ranger station roof. The abandoned building seemed to shrink around them, every creak and groan amplified by the storm outside. Emily stood beside him, flashlight illuminating the page. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Caleb began reading. If you're reading this, then they found the station before I could come back. That means I was right to hide the records separately. His pulse quickened immediately. Separately. Walter had divided the evidence. The metal container wasn't the final cache. It was insurance. The letter continued. Walter described months of investigation into altered land surveys throughout East Ridge. What began as routine observations had uncovered something far larger. Entire sections of public forest had quietly changed ownership. Survey markers had been moved, boundaries redrawn, official records rewritten. Most people never noticed because the affected areas were remote, isolated, easy to forget. But Walter noticed, and once he started looking, he couldn't stop. Emily listened silently as Caleb continued reading. Then one sentence changed everything. The records prove who was responsible. Silence settled between them. Proof. Not theories, not suspicions. Actual proof. Walter had found it. Yet if that proof existed, where was it now? Caleb kept reading. According to the letter, the documents had been hidden somewhere beyond East Ridge, a second location, one Walter trusted more than the ranger station. Unfortunately, the letter never named the place directly. Instead, Walter left another clue, another trail. Caleb almost laughed. Even after 40 years, the man refused to make anything simple. Then he noticed a folded map attached to the final page. His pulse accelerated. The map depicted a section of wilderness north of the station. Unlike previous maps, this one contained detailed notes written in red ink. Circles marked specific landmarks. Arrows connected ridges and valleys. One location stood out immediately. An abandoned mining camp. The words had been underlined repeatedly. Looks like our next destination, Emily said quietly. Caleb nodded. Before either could study the map further, a sudden sound echoed from somewhere outside. Both froze. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't wind. It was a vehicle. Distant but unmistakable. An engine climbing through the mountains. Emily immediately moved toward the nearest window. Tell me that's not another hiker. Caleb joined her. Through the rain, visibility remained poor. Yet after several seconds, headlights appeared far below the station. Moving slowly through the forest, his stomach tightened. Nobody should have been there. Not during a storm. Not on forgotten roads that barely existed anymore. The realization hit both of them simultaneously. Someone else knew about the station. Neither spoke. The headlights disappeared behind a ridge, then reappeared closer. Much closer. We need to leave, Emily said. Caleb agreed immediately. Within minutes, they packed the documents, Walter's letter, and the map. Whatever answers remained inside the station could wait. Getting trapped there could not. Rain intensified as they slipped into the forest behind the building. Instead of following the main trail, they moved along a narrow ridge Walter had marked years earlier. The decision proved wise. 20 minutes later, while looking back from higher ground, Caleb saw figures moving around the ranger station below. 3 people, flashlights cutting through darkness, searching. The sight sent a chill through him. They weren't imagining things. Walter hadn't imagined things either. Someone had been following this trail long before Caleb arrived. The group remained hidden among the trees until nightfall. Eventually, the flashlights disappeared. The station fell silent once more, yet neither felt comfortable returning. Instead, they established a small campsite beneath a rocky overhang overlooking the valley. The storm gradually weakened. By midnight, only light rain remained. Caleb used the time to examine the documents recovered from the metal container. Most involved survey records, property transfers, correspondence. Then he found something unexpected. A collection of letters. None had been mailed. All were addressed to different government agencies and newspapers. Walter had prepared multiple reports exposing the fraud. He simply never got the chance to send them. One letter in particular caught Emily's attention. "Look at this." Caleb moved closer. The letter referenced the company called Ridge Valley Development. According to Walter's notes, the organization acquired thousands of acres through manipulated surveys and falsified records. More importantly, one name appeared repeatedly throughout the documents: Richard Hale. Caleb froze. The same Richard Hale mentioned in Walter's journal. The man connected to East Ridge. The man Walter suspected from the beginning. Suddenly, the mystery felt far more concrete. They weren't chasing vague secrets anymore. They had names, companies, records, evidence. Yet one question remained unanswered. Why were people still searching 40 years later? Emily voiced the thought aloud. If this happened in the 80s, why does anyone still care? Caleb stared into the darkness beyond the campsite. The answer arrived moments later while sorting another folder. Property records, modern property records, updated only a few years earlier. His pulse quickened instantly. The land transfers never stopped. The scheme hadn't ended with Walter's disappearance. It continued, decade after decade. Different names, different companies, same methods, same land. That's why, Caleb said quietly. Emily looked up. He handed her the document. Her expression hardened immediately. The fraud wasn't history. It was ongoing. Walter's investigation remained dangerous because the people involved still benefited from the lies. Silence followed. The implications settled heavily between them. Then Caleb unfolded Walter's final map again. The abandoned mining camp sat marked near the northern edge. Beside it, Walter had written 6 words. The originals are hidden here. Caleb's heart pounded. Original records. The evidence Walter trusted more than anything else. Proof capable of exposing everything. Across the campsite, Emily stared at the map. Neither needed to say it aloud. The mining camp wasn't just another clue. It was the destination Walter had been protecting all along. Somewhere beyond the mountains, hidden among abandoned tunnels and forgotten structures, waited the final piece of the puzzle. And judging by the people who had just arrived at the ranger station, Caleb and Emily weren't the only ones searching for it. The hike to the abandoned mining camp began before dawn. Caleb barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flashlights moving around the ranger station. Someone else was following Walter's trail, someone willing to travel deep into forgotten wilderness during a storm. The realization transformed the entire investigation. It was no longer about solving a 40-year-old mystery. It was about reaching the truth before somebody else did. The first light of morning filtered through the trees as Caleb and Emily packed their camp. The air felt cold and damp after the night's rain. Mist drifted through the valley below. According to Walter's map, the mining camp sat roughly 8 miles north. The terrain between them and the destination would be difficult. Steep ridges, dense forest, rocky slopes. Yet neither considered turning back. They had come too far. By mid-morning, the landscape began changing. The forests thinned. Exposed rock formations appeared along the mountainsides. Occasionally, they discovered remnants of old mining activity, rusted cables, broken equipment, collapsed retaining walls, small clues suggesting that hundreds of people once worked in these mountains. Then, shortly before noon, they found another marker. Unlike Walter's previous clues, this one had been carved directly into stone. A simple arrow pointing north. Beside it sat 3 initials, W, R, R. Walter Reed. Caleb smiled despite himself. Even after all these years, Walter was still guiding them. Emily photographed the carving before they continued. Several hours later, they reached a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. The view immediately revealed the mining camp. Dozens of structures spread across the mountainside below. Most had collapsed long ago. Roofs had caved in. Walls leaned at impossible angles. Nature was steadily reclaiming everything. Yet the scales surprised them. This wasn't a small operation. At its peak, the camp must have housed hundreds of workers. More importantly, it offered dozens of places to hide something. Caleb studied Walter's map again. A red circle marked one specific building near the edge of the valley, an old administrative office. If Walter hid the original records, that was where they would be. The descent took nearly an hour. Every step heightened the tension. Neither spoke much. The closer they got, the more aware they became of how exposed they were. Then Emily stopped suddenly. "Look!" Caleb followed her gaze. Fresh footprints crossed a patch of mud near the entrance road. His pulse quickened instantly. Not old tracks, fresh ones. Maybe a day old, maybe less. Someone had reached the mining camp before them. Silence settled between them. The race had officially begun. Moving carefully now, they entered the camp. The abandoned buildings felt eerie in the afternoon light. Broken windows stared back like empty eyes. Wind moved through collapsed structures, creating strange echoes. More than once, Caleb caught himself glancing over his shoulder. The place felt watched. Eventually, they reached the office building marked on Walter's map. Unlike most structures, it remained partially intact. The roof still stood. Several walls remained solid. Caleb pushed open the front door cautiously. Dust filled the air immediately. The interior appeared untouched. Filing cabinets lined one wall. Broken desks occupied the center of the room. Old records lay scattered across the floor. Yet something felt wrong. Someone had searched here, recently. Drawers hung open. Cabinets stood empty. Debris appeared disturbed. They weren't the first visitors. "They're looking for the same thing," Emily whispered. Caleb nodded. The evidence was obvious. For the next hour, they searched room by room. Nothing. Then Caleb remembered something Walter once wrote. "The originals are hidden here, not stored here. Hidden." The distinction mattered. Walter wouldn't leave critical evidence inside an obvious filing cabinet. He would conceal it. The question was where. Frustration began building. Then a small detail caught Caleb's attention. One wall contained a large map of the mining camp itself. Unlike everything else, the frame remained securely attached. Curious. He removed it. Behind the map sat a metal access panel. His pulse accelerated immediately. Emily stepped closer. No way. The panel opened surprisingly easily. Inside rested a narrow compartment, and inside the compartment sat a waterproof metal case. Silence filled the room. Caleb slowly lifted it free. The case felt heavy, important. 40 years of mystery seemed concentrated inside that single container. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The contents exceeded every expectation. Original survey maps, property deeds, land transfer records, correspondence, contracts. Everything Walter spent years searching for. Everything proving the fraud existed. Everything connecting Ridge Valley Development and Richard Hale to decades of illegal land acquisitions. The evidence wasn't partial. It was complete. Emily stared in disbelief. This is enough. Caleb nodded slowly. More than enough. Walter had succeeded. The proof survived. Then he noticed one final item resting at the bottom of the case. A sealed envelope. Walter's handwriting covered the front. For whoever finally finds the truth. Caleb immediately opened it. The letter inside was surprisingly short. Walter explained everything. He discovered the fraud. He collected the evidence. Then he realized powerful people would do anything to stop him. Rather than risk losing the records, he hid them and disappeared. Intentionally. Caleb froze. Intentionally? Walter hadn't been murdered. He hadn't gotten lost. He chose to vanish. The revelation hit like a shockwave. Walter sacrificed his life as everyone knew it to protect the truth. Then came the final paragraph. If you're reading this, then you finished what I started. Don't waste time looking for me. By the time you find these records, I'll be long gone. Just make sure the truth isn't. Silence followed. Caleb lowered the letter slowly. Across the room, Emily remained equally stunned. 40 years of rumors, 40 years of mystery, and the answer had been sitting inside a hidden case all along. Then a floorboard creaked somewhere outside the office. Both froze instantly. Another sound followed. Footsteps. Close. Very close. Caleb's heart slammed against his ribs. Someone else had arrived. Someone who might already know exactly what they had found. He quickly closed the case and grabbed the records. Outside, the abandoned mining camp suddenly felt much smaller, much less empty. Because after finally uncovering Walter Reed's greatest secret, they had discovered one last problem. They still needed to get out of the mountains with it. The footsteps outside the office stopped as suddenly as they had begun. Caleb stood frozen beside the desk, one hand gripping the metal case filled with Walter Reed's evidence. Across the room, Emily held her breath. Neither moved, neither spoke. The abandoned mining camp seemed to have fallen completely silent. Then a voice echoed from outside. Caleb. Relief hit him instantly. He recognized the voice. Frank Dawson. Caleb exhaled sharply and stepped toward the doorway. Moments later, the old ranger appeared carrying a backpack and flashlight. Rainwater still clung to his jacket. Took me long enough to catch up to you two. Emily laughed nervously. You almost gave us heart attacks. Frank smiled faintly. Then he noticed the metal case resting in Caleb's hands. The smile disappeared, not because he was surprised, because he understood exactly what it meant. "You found it." Caleb nodded slowly. The old ranger stared at the case for several seconds. 40 years of unanswered questions seemed reflected in his eyes. Then he quietly sat down on a broken chair and looked around the office. Walter would be happy. The simple statement carried more emotion than anything else he could have said. They left the mining camp shortly afterward. None of them wanted to remain there longer than necessary. The evidence had survived for decades. Losing it now would be unforgivable. The hike back through the mountains felt entirely different from the journey in. Every step carried purpose. Every mile brought them closer to finally ending Walter's story. Along the way, Frank filled in the remaining gaps. After Walter disappeared, rumors spread quickly. Some people believed he abandoned the investigation. Others assumed he died in the wilderness. Frank never accepted either explanation. Walter wasn't the kind of man who quit, he said quietly. Caleb already knew that. Every journal page proved it. By the time they reached the lookout tower 2 days later, exhaustion had replaced adrenaline. Yet nobody wasted time resting. The documents immediately became the priority. Emily contacted trusted journalists, historical researchers, legal experts. Frank reached out to several retired officials he still respected. Within weeks, the story exploded across the region. The evidence proved everything Walter suspected. Land surveys had been manipulated, public records altered, thousands of acres quietly transferred through fraudulent schemes stretching back decades. Ridge Valley Development sat at the center of it all. Richard Hale's name appeared repeatedly throughout the original records. This time, however, the proof couldn't disappear. Too many copies existed. Too many people had seen it. Newspapers published investigations, state agencies reopened dormant files, historians verified Walter's findings. Families whose land had been taken unfairly finally learned the truth. The impact spread far beyond East Ridge. Yet amid all the attention, one mystery remained: Walter himself. Then, 3 months after the mining camp discovery, a letter arrived at the lookout tower. No return address, no explanation, just a plain envelope addressed to Frank Dawson. The old ranger opened it while sitting beside Caleb and Emily in the observation room. Silence followed. Frank read the contents twice. Then he handed the letter to Caleb. His pulse quickened immediately. The handwriting was familiar. Walter Reed. The room became perfectly still. According to the letter, Walter had never intended to disappear forever. He simply realized the evidence would never survive if he remained visible. So he left, changed his identity, started a new life far away. Most importantly, he trusted that someday someone would finish the work. He never expected to see the outcome himself. The letter had been mailed months earlier from another state. There was no address, no way to contact him. Just one final message. The tower was never about watching for fires. It was about protecting what people couldn't see from the ground. Caleb reread the sentence several times. Somehow it perfectly captured everything Walter had done. The months that followed brought enormous changes. Legal cases moved forward. Land records were corrected. Public forests received additional protections. Walter Reed's name was officially cleared. What had once been a disappearance became recognized as one of the most important whistleblower stories in the region's history. Yet the most meaningful change happened at the tower itself. Visitors began arriving regularly, Historians, reporters, hikers, families connected to the story. Everyone wanted to see the place where the mystery began. Caleb found himself giving tours, sharing Walter's story, explaining the investigation. Somewhere along the way, he stopped thinking about selling the property. The tower had become something larger than a real estate investment. It had become a piece of history. One autumn evening, nearly a year after buying the lookout tower, Caleb stood alone on the observation deck, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. Golden light stretched across endless forests. Wind moved gently through the tower supports. Far below, East Ridge glowed beneath the fading sky. The same wilderness Walter had spent years protecting spread in every direction. Behind him, the once abandoned tower felt alive again. Restored windows reflected the sunset. Fresh paint covered weathered walls. Visitors signed guest books inside. Laughter occasionally echoed through the structure. The place no longer felt forgotten. Caleb reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded Walter's final letter. He had read it dozens of times by now, yet one paragraph always stood out. If someone eventually opens that locked room, tell them not to waste their life looking backward. Use the truth to build something better. Caleb smiled. For months after losing his job and his relationship, he thought his life had fallen apart. Then he bought a worthless tower nobody wanted, a broken structure sitting alone on a mountain. What he found instead was purpose, friendship, history, direction. The irony still made him laugh sometimes. He came looking for a fresh start. He found a legacy. As darkness settled across the mountains and the first stars appeared overhead, Caleb looked out across the wilderness one final time. Somewhere out there, Walter Reed was probably living a quiet life. Unknown, unrecognized, exactly the way he wanted. But the truth survived. The story survived. And thanks to one locked storage room hidden beneath an abandoned lookout tower, an entire region finally knew what really happened. The wind swept across the observation deck as Caleb folded the letter and slipped it back into his pocket. Then he turned toward the warm light glowing inside the tower and headed home.